Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today for our first Boston Marketo User Group webinar of the year. Today's broadcast will be on reply email mining and is presented in partnership with our webinar platform partner On24. My name is Ed Burke. I'm Senior Manager of Marketing at HealthEdge, and I will be moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few quick housekeeping items. First, questions. Please send us your questions at any time during the broadcast using the questions panel on the side of your screen. During the broadcast, all attendees will be muted, but we will continuously monitor the questions panel and answer your questions at the end of the broadcast. Second, technical difficulties. If you experience technical difficulties during the broadcast, we suggest that you log out and then return to the webinar, as this typically resolves most connection issues. If you encounter persistent technical difficulties, you can contact On24 technical support. And finally, the recording. This broadcast is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to you within 48 hours via email. Well, that concludes the housekeeping items. Let's get started. I'd like to introduce our panelist for today's webinar, Matt Benatti. Matt is the CEO and co-founder of LeadGnome, the market-leading reply email mining web service. Matt is a passionate believer that sales and marketing alignment, transparency, and communication optimize revenue generation, and he champions this philosophy in his teams and writings. Matt participates actively in the market-changing Flip My Funnel, account-based marketing, and account-based everything communities. Matt's previous positions include VP of Marketing at LogMeIn, VP of Global Marketing at Attunity, and senior roles at Netezza and IBM. Over to you, Matt.
So I'm very excited to be joining this webinar and talking about something I'm very passionate about. I thought I'd start by just explaining where my passion for this topic comes from. I started with marketing, decade and a half ago, and a main component of that is all around the demand generation, of course, marketing operations, and all the automation that goes along with that, and certainly wanted to be hand in hand with the sales teams that I was a part of as well in order to drive the companies forward. And what I found was, being in the trenches and then eventually leading teams, was that reply emails have a tremendous amount of information in them, some which is tactical and some which is strategic in nature, and that the information that my teams were able to pull from from those emails, this source of data that I say is untapped for the most part, it was highly relevant and actionable by both the marketing and the sales teams at the organizations, and it brought us closer together, and we were able to drive more business and have happier customers and so on. And so that's where my passion for this topic comes from. So why don't we jump in and set the stage, and we can go to the next slide. So one thing that most of us are aware of is that our databases are in various states of erosion. And the challenge with our databases, particularly databases that grow, is that they need care and feeding. And this statistic from ZoomInfo saying that 94% of businesses believe that their databases have some inaccuracies in there is probably no shock to anyone. But I think it really sets the stage, because when our data is inaccurate, our way to go to market runs into trouble. A simple example of that would be having somebody's name incorrect, and so our personalization isn't accurate, and maybe our email doesn't look as good as it really should, and certainly doesn't connect with the person we're trying to engage with. Next slide. There have been many, many studies on the decay rate for our databases. And Hart Hanks has it at 70%. I've seen 72, I've seen 60, but it's a large number. And I think, again, as marketing professionals, most of us recognize that over a year's time, our databases are decaying at a significant rate. That could be from a variety of reasons. It could be from somebody leaving the company. It could be a title change, a phone number change, etc. We'll talk about different aspects of that and how to leverage that information coming back to us in replies in order to improve database health and improve our entire go-to-market. Next slide. So, if we think about a data source that would help us with these bullet points here, right, that helps us cleanse our database, it actually can enrich our database, deliver more folks to our database in order for us to understand the opportunities that present themselves and even increase engagement and accelerate sales cycles. All of this would be a wonderful data source if we could find one. And of course, next slide, it's no surprise that reply emails provide that. That's why I'm so passionate about this particular world that we live in here, and this data source that for most of us is untapped. I've been at very large companies, run marketing teams like LogMeIn. I've been at very small companies, and no matter how many people on staff, no matter how many marketing dollars we had, working through and handling all the replies that come in has always been a challenge. And yet, as the statistics here shows, email marketing continues to be the workhorse for good reason, because its ROI is so great. Its ability to provide us with the capability of delivering a message to the right person at the right time and begin to engage and build rapport is substantially greater than some other models. I'm not an advocate for this to be the sole channel of communication, but it's certainly one that has impressive capabilities. And it's unfortunate that for a variety of reasons, lack of resource, lack of time, lack of money, it's hard to get the feedback loop, that is, leverage the replies that come back in order to come full circle, provide extra oomph, if you will, to marketing automation, and certainly extra insight. So next slide, let's take a look at a typical flow. We send out our emails from our CRMs or our marketing automation platforms. Our intended recipient most of the time receives it. We'll talk about cases where that's not the case. And essentially one of three things happens. Either they don't open it or take no action on it. If things are going well and it's compelling, then they'll click on our call to action. And in some rare cases and powerful cases, they'll actually respond to our email. Those emails come back to us. Let's just say, for sake of argument, it's marketing@company.com. It comes back to that mailbox, and because of lack of resources, money, and time, generally speaking, the vast majority of those replies are simply wasted. They end up there. We may try and get in there. We may even have dedicated resources sometimes. But for the most part, it's very difficult to pull all the information out. Some companies, have a strategy of just looking for, say, unsubscribes. But as we'll see as we go forward here, the totality of the information that is in here is amazing. And and I encourage us as marketing community to go after this information because it helps not only us, but our customers. Next slide. So what I'm suggesting is a slightly modified data flow. And the idea here is that rather than allow this information to pass us by, recognize the fact that it is full of great information and do our very best at pulling that information out and leveraging it within the systems that we use day in and day out, whether that's a CRM or a map, in order to help us better with our go-to-market strategy, right? We want to improve our productivity. And as we see here, for the most part, you know, and the reason, full disclosure, I started an organization that automates this process, but for the most part, it's humans that are going in and trying to look through this information. And I think that's a real challenge, but I think the payoff is certainly something that is very useful on a variety of levels. And so we'll start to look at that. Next slide, please. So at a high level, and we'll go through examples of all of these, but the key benefits in my mind are our ability to grow pipeline and increase sales velocity, right? So this is not just a cost savings endeavor. We can really help drive the business. We can increase our database health through cleansing and appending or enriching of information. Certainly, it would be great if we could have some automation, but the other key aspect of this, and we want to make sure that we're looking at protecting our brand, and in many cases, sort of post-sales, for instance, renewals, we'll talk about that, protecting revenue, right? We want to make sure we see signs early of potential problems and adjust accordingly so that we do protect both brand and revenue. So let's take a look over the next couple of minutes at some examples of responses, both auto responses and personal or human responses. We'll talk about them and show some of the information that we can garner from it, and then talk about some of the best practices of how to leverage this information. So next slide. This is one of my all-time favorite auto replies, a left the company reply. And hopefully it's not too small on your screens, but essentially it says something, you know, along the lines of, hey, I'm no longer with this company. In this case, it's Pamela. The company, in this case, has written this auto response that says Pamela is no longer with the company, and that the new person replacing Pamela is Jenny, and give some information about that. Now, if we think about this from a tactical perspective, right, one of the things we could do with this information is to remove Pamela from our email send list, right? That's a very tactical thing, and then add Jenny into the mix. From a strategic perspective, maybe Pamela was a blocker to your sales activities. And now Jenny has replaced Pamela. Maybe she's more receptive to the work you're doing. And so, you know, there's a reason why marketing and sales can get together on this. And when you bring sales and marketing together with data like this, marketing provides tremendous relevance to the accounts that sales are working. Let's think about a post-sales initiative here. Maybe Pamela is the person and if that customer that was the person you would reach out to from an account manager perspective on renewal. Well, it's really important to know as far in advance that Pamela is no longer with the company and understand who the replacement is so that that renewal is not in jeopardy. We want to protect the revenue stream that is already in place. And of course, for SaaS companies, which many of us work at, that revenue stream is much different than it used to be with on-prem and support services, right? It's 100% year over year. So it's critically important that we know this type of information early. And so those pre and post sale pieces are really important. But I wanted to talk about another aspect of this. So let's go to the next slide. An even greater component of strategy here is that Pamela has moved on. And we know as salespeople that if we sell to somebody that we had a rapport with previously, they are very likely to purchase from us again. The statistics are staggering. So I show shift selling here. A gentleman by the name of Craig Elias has been in sales all his life. He teaches many sales teams around the world. He used to use hard bounced emails to propel his sales initiatives when he was on the front line selling. And what he found was that if he found a bounce, he knew that that person had moved on. And he would go find that person, and these days you would use something like LinkedIn, and then sell to that person. And on average, he would be able to close that deal 74% of the time because he was in there first and could shape that deal. Now, it turns out that Gartner has done a similar research on this, and they've come up, ironically, or maybe not ironically, but at 74% as well. So Craig's work had come before. Gartner also has driven to that same number. And this is staggering for our sales teams. So imagine as marketers that we're picking up this signal, right, this sales trigger event of somebody leaving the company, and we can pass that information, that insight, that intelligence on to our salespeople, and they now become the person that is most likely to win that deal. And this is an excellent close rate for organizations. And when I started working with Craig, the thing that he loved about looking for left the company emails is that they happen well before hard bounces, right? 6, 9 months, 12 months sometimes, right? We're talking multiple quarters that you have the jump on your competition if you are looking for these rather than waiting for bounces. And even in a bounce scenario, which most of our marketing automation systems can automatically remove from our list, right? That's the tactical piece. A lot of people really didn't look at them strategically like Craig did, and that was his advantage. Now we can look at left the company emails well before hard bounces occur and get an even greater advantage. And by the way, one other piece of, or depth to this is that many of the database vendors out there in the world look for trigger events. And when people move from company to company, that's one of the greatest trigger events that people rely on some of these great databases out there to provide to them. But they're all at the top echelon because those systems are looking for press releases when the person comes on board to the new company. So it's typically limited to V and C-level people, and it's certainly late. It's even later than a bounce because it's not often the case that you get a press release that says this VP is leaving. It's most often the case that you get this C-level person is coming on board. And so when you look at left the company emails, you get the timing advantage we've already talked about, but you also get a depth through the organization for some of these folks. I mean, directors, managers, they are all buyers, and now we have access to them. Next slide. Change of email address, a very common auto reply where we're sending to an email address that is about to be phased out. And in this case, it says, that Janet is, the email address is changing to this new email address. And so what we see here is that it's Janet at Smallfish, and the new email address is Janet at bigfish.com. I purposely made the domains, the email domains, overt of small and big because I wanted to highlight the point that certainly there's a tactical aspect of this, which we should just change Janet's email address in our system so that we can continue to nurture and work with her. But from a strategic perspective, something has happened, and it's one of two things. Next slide, please. Turns out, and this was the statistic as I dove deeper and deeper into reply email, 34% of companies change their names annually. This is a staggering number, and it's the one that shocked me the most. And so why does this happen? Well, it happens for the most part for one of two reasons. Either a rebranding event has taken place or an M&A event, a merger and acquisition event has taken place. In either case, certainly we want to do the tactical piece, which is to change in our marketing automation system. In Marketo, we want to change that to Janet.Jones at Big Fish. But we also want to alert the sales side of the house to the fact that something strategic has happened, and there's an opportunity here to engage with this organization and find out how this affects our position. It could be detrimental, and we want to be in a protect mode. It could be an opportunity where now Big Fish, right, a bigger company, we can sell more into them and leverage our champion that's already there. I use these techniques daily, and I have actually seen these types of things, both a left the company and an email change significantly affect our revenue stream. And so, I know that this works, and I know that salespeople love this kind of information. Next slide. Out of office, most people think of as an annoyance. In fact, some email service providers literally just by default weed these out. However, out of office responses, by the way, which make up 80% of all replies to email campaigns and so on, are full of incredible information that is leverageable in many, many ways. And so let's sort of take a look at this one. It says that I'm out of the office until a certain date, and for emergencies, here's my cell phone, and if you need some assistance for a couple of different reasons, here are some people you should reach out to. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing more information about the person that you originally reached out to, your original lead, in this case, Joe. You may not have known Joe's cell phone. And in an inbound method where maybe some of us are using a very frictionless, give me your email address for a newsletter kind of approach, right, to bring people into the mix and get them to opt in, we may not even know Joe's name, but we can provide Joe's name now for personalization. We even have his title in the signature, so we can segment. And we also know about Joe that he is out until the 15th. So from a tactical perspective, we can say things like, well, Joe is still at the company. That's a good thing. We have now Joe's name and title. Maybe we didn't have one or both of those before. We've got his company as well. And we're also enriching data by providing a cell phone number, right? So this is all good information. From a strategic position now, we're able to personalize our emails better. We're able to segment our emails better. We have a cell phone, which allows, maybe Joe is further down the line or needs to be, and now we have a multi-channel approach. We can actually call Joe. This is obviously very important, especially to the sellers at our organization. This is gold for them. And then there's this other piece, which is that Joe is out until a certain date. So a lot of folks that look at reply emails and a lot of our customers, in fact, love the idea that they know when somebody's coming back, because timing is everything in our world, right? It's the right message at the right time. And since we know Joe is coming back on the 15th, the right time is probably on the 16th to reach out to him, let him clean up from his vacation or the conference he went to, clean out his mailbox and get to task. But he's probably very receptive, or as receptive as he's going to be on the 16th. And so connect rates can be increased because of this information about the lead you already know from a simple out-of-office email. But there's much more here, right? We have 2 new contacts, or potentially net new contacts, and this allows us to understand and map out the accounts that we're trying to enrich our knowledge of, right, and engage more deeply with in order to make a sale. We know from research from multiple organizations that I think the number on average is 7 people to make an enterprise deal, or you need to connect with and engage with 7 people at that prospect. And an out-of-office, as well as a left-the-company, as we saw previously, help us to understand the folks within the organization. And so these out-of-office, which many of us may have thought of as an annoyance in the past, we have a lot of rich data here to leverage. Next slide. So the personal reply, the human reply. So for this webinar, as an example, Ed may receive some emails from you folks on the line. Hey, when is the replay going to happen? That would be a personal reply. Or, thanks for the invite to the webinar. Can you invite my peer because I know I'm not going to be there? Human replies are critically important. Now, they're few and far between in a marketing perspective, but they're critically important because somebody is actually engaging with us. And as marketers, that is just the dream, right? We want people to respond and work with us. Certainly want them to think about the calls to action, but coming back to us personally is also a wonderful thing. And so it's really important to leverage these and immediately get back to people. And that's a tough thing to do when you have a lot of replies. They just get buried, and they're not always easy to find. Both auto replies, they can mess up the subject lines when they come back, so you may not know exactly what they are. Personal replies are kind of needles in a haystack, but clearly very, very important to build rapport and engage with our prospects and customers. Next slide. So sometimes called spam traps, sender verification auto responses are becoming more and more common as spam filters are increasing their role in, if you will, protecting the folks within the organization. And Marketo and other types of marketing automation systems will say to you, hey, your email was delivered. But the reality is that's not always the case. The receiving server has allowed it to come in, right? It hasn't bounced it or pushed it away, but it's quarantined it. And so we're seeing, I have kind of a very interesting perspective here because I see so many of these given my line of work now, but we're seeing many, many spam filters push back, particularly on first emails into their organizations from email domains or organizations they haven't seen before. In fact, some companies immediately reject anything that's new that comes in. And sender verification emails, therefore, are very critically important for us as marketers and as salespeople to work with. Unfortunately, it's a purely manual process, but we can identify these and then go through that manual process so that our emails come out of quarantine and are actually delivered to the intended recipient. So, our open rates go up, our deliverability goes up, and our email reputations are enhanced, at least maintained, right? That's clearly important in today's world of higher, regulations and these spam filters and so on. So sender verifications are something that all of us should be looking for. And as an aside, I would also stress that when you're trying to engage with a new prospect, that you limit the number of people that you send to when you begin that engagement. So, as an example, if I were to send company ABC, I have 10 folks that I want to send to, I would not send to all 10 at one time. Even if they were an inbound, right, and they were asking for information from me or they wanted the newsletter or what have you, if you send a lot to them at once where they have a spam filter set up in this kind of mode, it will reject them. And in fact, it may blacklist you from sending to them. And so it's much more appropriate to send to a few, one or two, and make sure that if you get pushed back like this, you go through the manual process. If you don't, at least now your email is getting to the intended recipient. And when the spam filters see that it's opened, they will then allow you to engage more broadly across their organization. I've seen this time and time again where people, we're excited because we want to engage and we want to tell people about ways we can help them with their business, and we send to too many people at once. In today's world, spam filters are getting much more restrictive, and we can be cut off fairly quickly. Next slide. Unsubscribes. Clearly, we want to make sure that we're doing the right things with unsubscribes. And we get a lot of these, actually, outside of the 2-point font, same color, letters as the background links that we put in. We're getting better at that, but, there's still folks that don't like to click on those links. And they'd rather just quickly hit the reply button and say, take me off your list, or unsubscribe, or opt out, or whatever. There's a whole variety of things they say. And, it's just tough to find it. It doesn't say in the subject, unsubscribe all the time. Sometimes they do, right? Sometimes they just replace the subject with unsubscribe or opt out. They're a little bit more visible, but otherwise you're having to dig into these and find out what they're looking for. And then you have to manually go and update your records. But these are critically important, and they're even more important today with regulations. Certainly they were under canned spam, but CASL and GDPR just heighten our sensitivity to unsubscribes. So, this is one of those areas that we should be looking for as marketers and as salespeople, and as quickly as possible making sure that we pull these folks out of our email lists. This is a brand protection type of need. Not only is it a compliance need, but it doesn't take but one person to get upset about getting yet another email from you when they've asked you multiple times to take them off their list. What do they say? One piece of negative, information is just as powerful as 17 positive pieces, right? So negative messages have a very big impact, and we certainly don't want that. We don't want to harm our brand, and we don't want to annoy customers. They could come back to us, even if they're not ready now. We've all experienced this where, they thought they were ready, they had a project, that project was let go, they said, okay, I don't need these emails anymore, but 6 months later, they want to come back. If we're not responsive to them, they're going to get a bad taste in their mouth, and they may never come back to us. So unsubscribes are clearly something we want to take a look at. Next slide. And this just shows, obviously there's teeth in these compliance regulations now, even more so on the GDPR side. Next slide. So I have seen and I have used email mining to deliver all of these kinds of benefits to the organizations I've worked for, from very tactical pieces of database health and cleansing, to truly being a partner that's providing highly relevant, actionable sales opportunity, sales cycle intelligence and insights to my sales counterparts. And that's just an amazing feeling when sales looks at marketing and says, wow, I'm looking forward to the information that I'm getting from them. And of course, as we can see at the bottom, there are many pre and there are certainly many post use cases for reply emails. Next slide. So again, disclaimer, clearly, this is a passion of mine. I built a company around it because I know the value of it. But I did want to take just 2 slides to show you sort of how automation adds value, because a key part of this is taking folks out of the loop, freeing up precious resources, and replacing it with something that can automate this process. Next slide. So really the change here is inserting a automation piece like LeadGnome. And it's an artificial intelligence engine that takes a look at this information and does all the things we just talked about, identifying, categorizing, and synchronizing the data with Marketo in order to reduce costs, allow critical staff members to go and do more relevant things that a human really needs to do, think through strategies to go to market, et cetera. And so, the data entry itself and the looking through the information, I've sent people in. I know others probably on the phone or on this webinar have, teams or a person who's burdened with this, and it is really painful. If you haven't experienced it, listen to the folks on your staff that have that as a task. It is very, very painful. The first person I ever sent in to go do this, they came back. They spent a couple of days, came back with some information. It didn't have all the right things in it, columns in a spreadsheet kind of thing. I asked them to go back and pull out the other pieces. And by the end of that round, he literally said to me, please don't make me do that again. I don't want to do that. And so I know there's a lot of folks that do look at this and say, I know there's information and I just can't get to it. Automation can make that a reality and really propel us. So let's go to the next slide. So the added benefits, if you will, of automation is to identify automatically those replies, classify each of them, which allows us to trigger Marketo programs and allow us to work with interesting moments in order to help both the marketing and sales or the smarketing kind of endeavors, as well as clean up inboxes. So part of automation is also neatly tucking away those responses. A great example of that would be to take all of the sender verifications, which unfortunately, by their definition, mandate a manual process like a CAPTCHA, right? We can neatly put them into a folder right in your Gmail or Outlook, as an example, and now the person that's responsible for looking at those and going through that manual step, they're all in one place, ready for them to just go one by one. You no longer have to dig through all the 1,000 or whatever emails to find the 5 that came back. The 5 are in a separate folder. So, there's lots of aspects of automation that can help, and I'm just trying to provide a couple of those here. So the next slide is really the last slide, and the wrap-up for me is that, reply emails provide a tremendous amount of value, and there's been writings about that, even on the sales side. If you've read Predictable Revenue by Aaron Ross, he has a 1 or 2 paragraph in the book that says, literally says something like, don't forget out-of-office emails. They're literally full of gold. And so we know it's there, and it's painful to get to, but whether you do it manually or you look for an automation, I encourage you to leverage it, because not only can it help you on the database health side, but it can, and the cost side, but it can truly drive revenue and bring sales and marketing closer together. And when that happens, it's always been my experience that the company is more productive. So with that, if we have some questions, I'll take those.
Thanks, Matt. And a number of questions have come in during the webinar. Several attendees have submitted questions relating to compliance with regulations like CAN-SPAM, CASL, and GDPR. A few attendees specifically are interested about how reply email mining can assist them with GDPR. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like CASL back in July, I believe, GDPR is sort of going to be activated, right? We've known about GDPR for a while, but its active date is May 25th of this year. And there's a lot of angst about it, and I think rightly so. How do we deal with this? Certainly, we need to look for unsubscribes, right? It's just a basic fundamental thing, and that can be very painful. But we need to do that as organizations. The other aspect that comes up a lot is, Matt, you talk about pulling net new contacts from left to company emails and out of office emails and so on. Are they usable, right? Because they haven't opted in. And everybody's concerned with GDPR and CASL in particular because they're opt-in, models as opposed to CAN-SPAM, which is an opt-out. Can we leverage those net new contacts and reach out to them for marketing and sales? It turns out that we can. Under CASL, it's allowed via a section called implied consent, and in GDPR, there's something called legitimate interest. For those of you that know the GDPR, have been reading through it, it's recital 47, I believe. I've done a lot of work with this, with these topics. Our site has some articles on it and a whole page dedicated to it in the resources section. Feel free to read that. I even went so far as to work with a EU-based law firm, Field Fisher. They're very well known for their privacy work, and they have created for me a legal opinion talking about the net new contacts derived from replies and their applicability in the sales and marketing to B2B fashion. By the way, reply emails, frankly, are a B2B notion. I probably should have mentioned that up front. B2C doesn't sort of play in that space. But anyway, if anybody's interested in a copy of that legal opinion, which spells out, sort of makes the discussion from here's what GDPR is all about, here's the context of sort of reply emails, why it's lawful to leverage these net new contacts for GDPR and e-privacy regulations, I'd be happy to share that. So just reach out to me. I think, all of my contact information will be available to you.
Thanks, Matt. Another question that's on our audience's mind today, generally maintaining the database seems to be a common thread. One attendee is asking, what percentage of the database can be maintained annually using reply emails?
That's a great question. So it actually depends on the volume and frequency of your sends. So if we think about sending to our database twice or 3 times a month, and of course, that varies, but if you think about that, we're talking somewhere around 70-72% of our database will be maintained. That is, we'll know that the person is still there or they've left, a title change, etc. And the way that math works out is, generally speaking, sort of the steady state for month to month is about a 2 to 3% response rate from your email campaigns. These response rates go up, as you might imagine, during heavy conference times for your vertical, certainly vacation times like over the summer or at the end of year holidays or 4th of July, things like that. And so they can spike to double that percent. But if we just take the steady state of 2 to 3%, the way the math works out, we're looking at touching, on average, about 70 or 72% of our database. So it's very worthwhile. And by the way, that's on an annual basis.
Matt, related to that, another attendee is wondering how many new contacts should they expect to gain from reply emails? Right.
So again, using those same percentages, it turns out that our customers, and so I'm sort of using data that I see from our customers, that same 2 to 3% of replies, of course, contain left the company and out of office and so on. And because of those, we're seeing about a 55 or 60% of the replies coming with an alternate contact. And so if we do the math, the raw math tells us that's about 24 to 36% annually, but there's likely to be some overlap with your database. And so I tend to be very conservative about this because I think that's sort of the way to approach this. And if people get more, that's great. But we typically talk about a 20 plus percent additional contacts to your database on an annual basis. And that's proven out fairly typically for our customer base. That's significant, right? We know that, and I don't think I showed this stat, but the census, right, the government census, as well as some other studies, show that about 30% or so of employees will change companies each year. And so if we're able to work with our decaying databases and the attrition of people out that's 30, and reply emails by themselves can add somewhere around 20, that's pretty good.
Thank you, Matt. And with that question, we'll bring today's broadcast to a conclusion. Thank you all again very much for attending the webinar today. As a reminder, today's broadcast was recorded, and the recording will be made available to you via email. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.